The limp appeared first. Small. Deliberate. The kind of asymmetry most people didn't notice because most people weren't trained to see what bodies were hiding. Hannah Clarke moved through the ICU corridors of Seattle General in Raleigh with the gait of someone who'd learned to redistribute weight across bones that weren't entirely her own. Titanium and flesh. Prosthetics and scars. Muscle memory that predated the civilian scrubs by 18 years. She didn't flinch when fluorescent lights hummed their electric hymn overhead. Didn't wince when the antiseptic smell hit, that sharp chemical burn like copper and bleach mixed with industrial cleaner. Her hands moved through the motions of patient care with the same precision she'd once used threading sutures in field hospitals under mortar fire. Every detail documented. Every timestamp logged in military time without thinking, 0730 instead of 7:16 a.m., a habit that ran deeper than her false identity. Room for 12 was empty except for the echoing silence of a patient admitted 3 hours earlier. Hannah wiped down the bed frame with deliberate strokes, watching the fluorescent light catch the condensation on the metal rails. The linen smelled like bleach and something else, that particular staleness of a room no one had occupied long enough to leave an imprint. She documented vitals with unusual meticulousness, her handwriting tight and angular, the kind that belonged to someone trained to write clearly under conditions where clarity meant survival. The ICU window faced the main monitoring station. Through the glass, she could see the nameplate on the isolation room 3 doors down. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb. The Marine General lay in that bed, catastrophic injuries catalogued in her memory the way other nurses might remember a favorite song. She'd seen him survive worse than this. Not better, worse. Helmand Province. 2009, the same dust that buried Sanjin Valley was in both their lungs still, she suspected. Her fingers unconsciously traced the slight bulge at her right ankle where the prosthetic joint shifted beneath her scrubs. The titanium was cool against her skin even through the fabric. She'd learned years ago not to hide it but not to announce it either. Just another nurse with a slight limp. Just another person carrying invisible weight. The intercom crackled. Code blue, Trauma Bay 2. Her body went very still for exactly 2 seconds, then resumed normal function. Not her patient. Not her code. Not yet. Dr. Pierce entered the ICU unit at 0847, his white coat pristine as a flag at half-mast. He scanned the patient boards with the focused intensity of someone hunting. His eyes were the color of shallow water, pale, reflective, revealing nothing. He moved through the unit like a man who'd never once considered the possibility of his own insignificance, and the nurses parted for him the way water parts for a stone dropped from sufficient height. His gaze caught the chart for room for 12. The patient who'd been admitted at 0430 with acute myocardial infarction. Hannah's documentation filled the chart like evidence, like testimony. Vitals recorded every 15 minutes instead of the standard 30. Medication timestamps precise to the minute. Notes that read like legal depositions, clear, specific, impossible to misinterpret. He picked up the chart. His jaw tightened in a way that was barely visible but absolutely certain. The kind of tightening that said someone had just registered a threat they hadn't expected to encounter. Hannah was in room for 10, documenting post-op vitals for a spinal fusion patient, when Dr. Pierce's voice cut through the unit like a blade through silk. Ms. Clarke. Not a question. Not a greeting. A summons delivered in front of the patient's entire family, daughter, son-in-law, elderly mother clustered around the bed like flowers around a grave. She turned. Didn't hurry. Didn't apologize for existing. Moved into room for 12 with the same deliberate pace she'd used moving toward position in Kandahar. The patient's face was gray with pain, sweat pooling beneath the hospital gown. You administered the 0630 morphine dose. Dr. Pierce's voice was smooth as river stones. The patient's pain scale was 9. Chart says you didn't medicate until 0645. The family stared. The wife's hands gripped the bed rail hard enough to go white. Doctor ordered the previous dose withheld pending cardiac clearance. Hannah's voice was level as a surgical table. I documented the order at 0623. Waited for your clearance. You approved morphine administration at 06 for 4. What I'm hearing is the patient suffered 15 minutes of unnecessary pain on your watch. The daughter's face hardened. The son-in-law's jaw clenched. They were looking at Hannah the way people look at someone they've just decided wasn't trustworthy. She could feel the judgment settling into the space between them like ash. I followed your orders, doctor. Your documentation is unclear. He turned to face the family fully, his body language opening like a door meant to separate Hannah from human consideration. You should know that medication timing errors are among the most serious protocol violations in nursing. I'll be reviewing all of Ms. Clarke's recent chart work. He didn't wait for response. Just turned and moved to the next room, his white coat moving like a banner behind him. The family looked at Hannah differently now, the way you look at someone you've decided isn't good at their job. The wife's grip on the bed rail loosened. She'd already written the story in her head and Hannah was the villain in every frame. Hannah documented the encounter with clinical precision. 08 for 7, Dr. Pierce. Disputed medication timing. Clarification offered and rejected. She wrote it all down knowing it would be found, read, interpreted, and used against her. Knowing that meticulous documentation was either your greatest asset or your greatest liability depending on who was reading it. The break room was in the northeast corner of the second floor, 2 flights down from the ICU. The space smelled like stale coffee and something microwaved and forgotten. 3 nurses were already at the far table, Carla, Devon, and someone new whose name Hannah hadn't learned yet. She grabbed a coffee from the pot that had been brewing since 0600 and sat at the opposite end of the break room. The conversation stopped. Just ceased, like a radio turned off mid-song. She didn't look up. Just opened her lunch container, grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, the disciplined eating of someone who understood that fuel was fuel and pleasure was something soldiers learned to live without. She ate methodically while the 3 nurses sat 12 feet away and began talking again, their voices dropping to the particular frequency of people discussing someone they believed wasn't supposed to hear them. Did you hear what happened in 412? Pierce was absolutely shredding her. In front of the family. My cousin works at Duke. She said Pierce has done this before. Humiliates nurses in front of patients, then files formal write-ups. 15 minutes? That's what he's claiming. That's what I heard. Says she delayed morphine. But that seems. Doesn't matter what seems. He's a doctor. She's a nurse. Who do you think the hospital believes? Hannah chewed chicken that tasted like nothing and stared out the break room window at the parking lot 3 stories below. Cars glinted in the October sunlight like beetles. The sky was the color of old concrete. She could see the main entrance from here, the ambulance bay where 3 vehicles sat idling, waiting. She'd been waiting too, just differently. The patch was in her locker. Faded. Barely larger than a thumbnail. The unit insignia from Helmand Province sewn into the jacket lining that hung in the bottom of the locker behind her spare scrubs. Nobody ever looked there. Nobody ever thought to. It was just a nurse's locker, just a place where people stored their civilian clothes and their thermos cups and the small things they needed to pretend they were ordinary people living ordinary lives. But Hannah Clarke wasn't ordinary. She was Captain Hannah Clarke, United States Marine Corps, decorated veteran of 3 tours in Afghanistan, attached to JSOC Task Force 121 for 2 of those tours. Medical discharge in 2014. Bilateral lower limb amputation sustained while dragging 3 Marines to safety under fire. Titanium prosthetics. Physical therapy that lasted longer than most people's careers. And then, 6 months ago, a phone call from someone who didn't give a name, asking if she'd be willing to do something that wasn't quite legal and definitely wasn't quite military but required a person with her particular skill set. The Marine General in the ICU, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, was the reason she was here. The brass wanted him monitored. Wanted to know if the surgeon providing his post-operative care was actually the best surgeon or if he was just the cheapest. Wanted someone embedded in the hospital who would notice the small discrepancies, the billable procedures that never actually happened, the phantom surgeries that appeared in charts like ghosts. Hannah had taken the job because she understood what it meant to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, and because sitting at home pretending to be a civilian was killing her slower than combat ever had. The break room clock showed 12:03. 47 minutes until the end of her shift. The three nurses at the far table were still talking, their voices pitched to the frequency of conspiracy. Carla was saying something about Pierce's pattern, about how he always targeted certain nurses, about how nobody had ever successfully challenged his documentation because his paperwork was always immaculate. That was the other thing about Dr. Pierce that Hannah had noticed in her 3 weeks at Seattle General. He was competent. Efficient. His charts were meticulous. His documentation was precise. He wasn't a villain because he was sloppy or desperate. He was dangerous because he was careful, because he understood systems, because he knew exactly how to weaponize institutional authority against people who had no authority to weaponize back. And 3 days ago, while cross-referencing chart codes for a patient intake procedure, Hannah had glimpsed something in the hospital billing system. Procedure codes. Authorization timestamps. Phantom surgeries listed on the general's account. Tests that appeared in the documentation but not in the patient's actual medical record. The kind of discrepancies that were usually invisible because nobody had time to check, nobody cared enough to verify, nobody knew how to read between the lines of medical bureaucracy the way a person with intelligence training knew how to read them. Pierce was running insurance fraud. Not on one patient. On multiple patients. The codes were sophisticated enough that they'd probably passed every preliminary audit. The documentation was detailed enough that they looked legitimate. But they weren't there. The procedures never happened. The treatments never occurred. And every single one of those phantom procedures was being billed to TRICARE, the military health insurance system. Which meant Dr. Pierce wasn't just running a fraud scheme. He was stealing from the same system that had paid for Hannah's prosthetics, the same system that kept disabled veterans alive, the same system that belonged to people like the general lying 3 floors above them. Hannah finished her lunch. Stood. Rinsed her container in the sink while the 3 nurses at the far table fell silent again, watching her move through the break room like she was a threat they hadn't yet figured out how to neutralize. She didn't make eye contact. Didn't acknowledge the silence. Just moved back toward the ICU with a slight limp that masked everything underneath, the titanium and the training and the decision she'd made 6 months ago to become someone's quiet guardian. The intercom crackled again. Code blue, Trauma Bay 4. The radio squawked. Somewhere in Seattle General, someone was dying, and people were running toward them instead of away, which was what separated nurses from normal human beings and what had always been true about Hannah Clarke even before the discharges and the prosthetics and the undercover assignments that nobody would ever officially acknowledge. She had 14 minutes left in her shift when Dr. Pierce entered the ICU again, this time with a folder that looked like it contained official documentation, something with the hospital logo embossed on the cover, something that looked very much like the beginning of the end of someone's employment. He didn't approach her directly. Just placed the folder on the unit supervisor's desk and made sure she'd see it when she got back from the trauma code. Hannah glimpsed her own name on the label before turning away, moving toward the medication cart with the particular grace of someone who'd been trained to process threats without flinching. She had 4 days before this got worse. Room 308 held the weight of 7 people, an elderly man in the bed, his wife clutching a rosary in the visitor's chair, 2 adult children standing at the foot, a grandson perched on the window sill. Hannah adjusted the fall line with the precise movements of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, her fingers steady as surgical steel. The morning light caught the edge of her name badge, worn silver from years of work. Dr. Pierce's shadow appeared in the doorway before his voice did. Nurse Clarke. The temperature in the room shifted. The grandson sat up straighter. The wife's prayer stopped mid-whisper. I specifically ordered pain medication at 2 p.m. hours, Pierce said, stepping into the room like a general inspecting troops. His voice carried the particular cruelty of someone accustomed to obedience. It is now 14:17. 17 minutes late. In front of a Marine general's family, I will not tolerate this level of incompetence. Hannah's hands didn't pause. She finished adjusting the 4-drip rate, 12 milliliters per hour, exactly as prescribed, and turned to face him. Her voice remained level, each word placed like a tile in a mosaic. "Doctor, you countermanded that order at 13:45 and instructed me to wait until after the CT scan results returned. The results came back at 14:09. I administered the medication at 14:11. The wife's eyes darted between them. The daughter leaned forward slightly. "Are you arguing with me in front of a patient's family?" Pierce's voice rose, sharp enough to cut glass. His presence seemed to expand, filling the small room with the suffocating weight of institutional authority. "This is exactly the kind of negligence I've been documenting. Selective memory about orders, chart tampering, insubordinate tone." Hannah took one measured breath. She did not blink. She did not look away. But in the corner of her left eye, a single tear formed, catching the fluorescent light like a perfect crystal. She wiped it once, slowly, without breaking eye contact with Pierce. When she spoke, her voice carried something beneath the words, something that made the grandson unconsciously straighten his spine. "I follow every order to the letter, Doctor. Perhaps we should review the written record together. In private. With the medication administration timestamps." Pierce's smile was a weapon. "Oh, we will review records, nurse. Though I suspect the documentation trail will speak for itself." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. His eyes flicked to her slight gait, the compensation in her left side, barely perceptible to untrained eyes. "Dismissed." The grandson watched her leave. So did everyone else. Hannah moved through the corridor with the fluid precision of someone who'd learned long ago that dignity was a kind of armor you wore in your shoulders. But that wasn't the worst part. By the time she reached the nurse's station, other staff members were reading the write-up that had appeared on the unit bulletin board while she'd been in room 308. Fabricated medication errors. Protocol violations with dates that didn't match her schedule. Insubordinate conduct. All in bold letters under her name. The break room at 12:30 felt like walking into a minefield with a sandwich. Hannah pushed through the glass doors, lunch bag in hand, and made her way to the center table where Jessica, Ramon, and Beth were unpacking their meals. The moment her chair scraped the floor, something shifted in the air, a synchronized movement that felt choreographed. All three of them stood, gathered their food, and migrated to the far corner table without making eye contact. Their voices dropped to pointed whispers. "Did you see the write-up on the board? Third one this month. Pierce says she's a liability risk." Hannah unwrapped her turkey sandwich with hands that did not shake. She ate alone, the fluorescent lights overhead humming their electronic dirge, each flicker counting off the seconds of isolation. Through the break room window, she could see the bulletin board outside the locker room, her name in bold like a warning label. She could also see the corner of something taped to the inside of her locker door, a crayon drawing her daughter had made 3 weeks ago. Stick figures. One labeled Mommy, one labeled me, between them the words the hero spelled backwards in 7-year-old letters. Hannah ate the sandwich. Drank the water. Did not look back at the corner table. By 16:45, Dr. Pierce had assembled the entire ICU staff in the conference room on the 2nd floor. Hannah sat in the 3rd row, flanked by empty chairs, a quarantine no one needed to speak aloud. Pierce stood at the front with a stack of papers, his expression that of a man conducting necessary surgery. "We need to discuss standards of care," he began, his voice smooth as surgical lubricant. "Our ICCU requires physicians to maintain final authority over all patient care decisions. When nurses deviate from physician orders, when they alter documentation, when they access confidential records beyond their scope of practice, these are not minor infractions." He tapped the first write-up with his index finger. The sound was deliberate, sharp. Hannah Clarke has been flagged multiple times for medication timing discrepancies. Each incident has been carefully documented with precise timestamps and witness statements from medical staff. Hannah knew those timestamps were fabrications. She also knew that no jury, no court, no nursing board, would believe her over a prestigious physician with a stack of official paperwork. Pierce had been building his narrative for weeks, each false entry a brick in a wall. Effective immediately, Hannah will be reassigned from the ICU to the surgical recovery unit on the 4th floor. Pierce allowed himself a thin smile. This is not a disciplinary action, it's a protective measure. Joint Commission regulations require that high-risk patients in intensive care remain under the direct supervision of physicians without documented performance concerns. The high-risk patient. The Marine General. After the meeting dispersed, Hannah walked to the unit bulletin board. The write-ups were arranged in chronological order, each one more elaborate than the last. Unauthorized chart modifications. Insubordinate conduct. Inappropriate access to confidential billing information. There was even one citing her for suggesting improvements to unit protocols without physician approval. All lies. All perfectly documented. She signed the acknowledgement form with her name in capital letters, each stroke deliberate and clear. Her handwriting looked the way it always did, strong, steady, the script of someone who'd signed weapons inventory logs and casualty reports and court-martial statements without flinching. But her photographic memory was cataloguing something else entirely. That evening, at 7 p.m. hours, Hannah performed her final rounds in the ICU before her reassignment took effect. She entered the Marine General's room and let the door close behind her with the soft whisper of hydraulics. Marcus Webb lay supine on the ventilator, his chest rising and falling in mechanical rhythm. The monitors tracked his vital signs: heart rate 67, blood pressure 119/71, oxygen saturation 96%. Stable. For now. She pulled up his chart on the bedside computer, ostensibly to verify his medication schedule. But her eyes moved to the billing code section, and what she saw there made her photographic memory flare like a spotlight. Phantom surgical procedures. Anesthesia hours that didn't correspond to any documented operations. Equipment charges duplicated across 3 separate dates. Tricare fraud. Millions of dollars in false claims, all funneling through Dr. Pierce's authorization signatures. Procedure codes that didn't exist in the medical records. Medication charges for drugs she'd never administered. Hannah didn't take screenshots. Didn't make notes. Her training had taught her that digital footprints were how operatives got burned. Instead, she committed the sequence to memory, the way she'd committed every position of every convoy route through Helmand Province, the way she'd memorized the faces of 17 Taliban fighters from surveillance photos, the way she'd retained the dosage protocols for 63 different trauma medications. She closed the chart and stood motionless beside the general's bed for exactly 10 seconds. Then she left. Walking back through the ICU hallway, her pace even and measured, she passed Dr. Pierce's office. The door was open. Pierce sat behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low but not quiet enough. The general's account is worth 6 figures in billings before discharge. We just need to keep adding procedures, keep the family confused with medical jargon. The nursing staff won't question it if the documentation looks official. Hannah kept walking. She reached the nurse's station and was reviewing the medication schedule for another patient when Pierce appeared. He'd materialized like a bad smell, suddenly present, impossible to ignore. His eyes narrowed as they tracked the computer screen in front of her. "Were you accessing the general's financial records, Clarke?" Hannah's fingers remained motionless on the keyboard. When she spoke, her voice was exactly what he expected, deferential, careful, the script of a nurse who understood her place in the hierarchy. "I was reviewing his medication schedule, doctor. Ensuring continuity of care before my reassignment." Pierce leaned close enough that she could smell the cologne he wore, expensive and cloying. "You ask too many questions. You document too much. You notice things that aren't your concern." His voice dropped to something that sounded almost like respect, which made it infinitely more threatening. "I suggest you focus on the surgical recovery unit and let the physicians handle complex patient management." "Of course, doctor." He walked away. That night, Hannah drove home in silence, her hand steady on the steering wheel of a 5-year-old Honda that had never seen combat, in a uniform that nobody recognized as such. Dr. Pierce was building his paper trail with the precision of someone who'd done this before. Fourth formal complaint submitted, this one citing inappropriate access to confidential billing information. He'd also filed directly with the state nursing board that morning, his documentation trail meticulously constructed with incident reports, policy violation citations, and witness statements from staff he'd coached. She couldn't report the fraud without blowing her cover. Her classification was compartmentalized 3 levels deep. Her nursing position was an official Pentagon operation with a code name she couldn't speak aloud, even to hospital administrators, revealing it would compromise the entire security apparatus protecting the Marine General. But Pierce was accelerating, and she was running out of time. At home, her 7-year-old daughter was asleep, her shoes by the door, her backpack slouched in the corner. Hannah stood in the kitchen at 23:17, staring at nothing, her mind processing data points like a targeting computer. Fraud exposure would destroy Pierce. But it would also expose her. Federal agents. Pentagon oversight. Her daughter asking questions that couldn't be answered. Her mother calling to ask why there were federal investigators in their neighborhood. The thing about being a captain was that sometimes the hardest decisions came in the dark, alone, where nobody could witness what it cost to stay silent. The ICU doors opened at 2:08 p.m. 5 hours later. Dr. Pierce walked through them like a man carrying news that would reshape someone's entire existence. His shoes clicked against the tile with the precision of a metronome. Behind him, 2 hospital security officers in navy blazers flanked him like sentries. In his hands, a manila folder thick enough to require both palms to hold steady. The folder was overstuffed with papers, printed emails, incident reports, policy citations, each one stamped with the hospital's red seal. Hannah was at the medication station on floor 4 when the call came through the unit intercom. Nurse Clarke, report to the main administrative office. Immediately. She didn't move for 3 seconds. The foot bag she'd been hanging continued its steady drip. Her hands remained exactly where they were, adjusting the rate valve. Around her, 2 junior nurses glanced up briefly, then away, the kind of look people give to someone about to receive terrible news. They already knew. Of course they knew. In a hospital, nothing stays private for longer than a coffee break. The administrative office was carpeted. That was the first thing that always struck her about this space, the thick beige carpet, the kind designed to swallow footsteps and make voices sound smaller than they were. Soft lighting. An air conditioning vent that hummed like a creature barely conscious. Everything designed to cushion bad news. Dr. Pierce was already seated when she entered. 2 chairs across from his. One remained empty. He gestured to the occupied one without making eye contact. Sit, please. Hannah Saturday. Her posture remained unchanged, spine straight, hands folded in her lap, eyes forward. She had survived worse offices than this one. Much worse. She had sat across from battalion commanders in plywood shacks while mortar rounds shook the walls. This was carpet and fluorescent panels. This was nothing. Pierce opened the folder with the ceremonial slowness of a man who had rehearsed this moment multiple times. I've reviewed your file extensively, he began. His voice carried the tone of someone reading an indictment. Over the past 3 weeks, I've documented 17 instances of protocol deviation. Policy violations. Medication administration errors. Insubordination toward attending physicians. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. Then another. Then a third. Each one was a write-up. Each one bore her name. Each one described incidents she either didn't remember or knew were fabricated outright. The medication timing discrepancy from the first day, written as a 15-minute delay caused by her negligence when the delay had been caused by his contradictory verbal orders. An incident report about her challenging his pain medication dosage for a post-op patient, written as insubordination when she'd merely asked for clarification about the dose for a 34-pound pediatric patient. A witness statement from a nurse she'd never spoken to, claiming she'd made derogatory comments about Dr. Pierce's clinical judgment. "These are witness statements," Pierce continued, sliding more papers forward. "From staff members who have observed patterns of behavior suggesting you are not fit for ICU-level nursing." Hannah recognized none of the names. Pierce removed a second document from the folder. Official letterhead. Joint Commission standards printed at the top. His voice dropped, becoming almost regretful, the performance of a man sorry to deliver such findings. "On day 1 of your assignment to this unit, you performed an unauthorized medical procedure. A needle decompression for suspected tension pneumothorax. Without physician oversight. Without explicit orders from the attending. This violates Joint Commission Standard IC.01.01, which explicitly requires that all invasive procedures be performed under direct physician supervision or with clear verbal authorization documented in real time." He looked up from the page. "Do you dispute this?" Hannah didn't respond. She couldn't. Not without saying the words that would end everything, that she performed the procedure because the general was dying, that Pierce's protocols were costing lives, that the chest tube he'd placed was failing and she was the only person in that room trained to recognize it. "This incident alone is grounds for immediate termination," Pierce continued. "But combined with the pattern of protocol violations, the medication errors, the insubordination, combined with the State Nursing Board complaint I filed this morning, this becomes a matter of patient safety." He stood. He was still speaking, but Hannah's focus had narrowed to a single point, the realization that she was trapped. Completely. Utterly. Trapped. If she defended herself, she would have to explain that she wasn't a civilian nurse. That her nursing license was a cover for a classified Pentagon operation called Nightingale. That she'd been inserted into Seattle General specifically to protect a Marine general whose convoy she'd served alongside 7 years ago. That the procedure she'd performed had saved his life. That Dr. Pierce was running an insurance fraud scheme that had already built Tricare for approximately $847,000 in phantom procedures. She couldn't say any of that. Because saying it would burn her cover completely. It would expose the entire operation. It would mean the Pentagon would have to extract her immediately, which meant the general would lose the only person in the hospital who understood his injuries at a level that went beyond standard medical training. It meant her daughter would grow up knowing her mother was something other than what she'd claimed. It meant the careful architecture of her undercover life would collapse into rubble. So she sat still. Silent. Hands folded. "Your access to the ICU is revoked effective immediately," Pierce said, sliding a keycard across the desk. It was her badge. She'd noticed it missing from her pocket an hour ago and had assumed it was in her locker. "Your security clearance for that unit has been deactivated. If you approach the ICU or attempt to access restricted patient information, alarms will trigger and hospital security will be notified. You'll be reassigned to Floor 7, Med-Surg Acute Care. Low acuity patients only. You'll work the day shift, Monday through Friday. Your nights and weekends are suspended pending the outcome of the State Board review." He closed the folder. The gesture was final, the sound of a coffin lid. "I understand this is difficult news," he continued, and she could hear something in his voice now that hadn't been there before. Satisfaction. The particular satisfaction of a man who had successfully removed an obstacle. "But patient safety must be our primary concern. Your safety as well. Perhaps a less demanding assignment will be better suited to your current capabilities." Hannah stood. She placed her old badge on the desk. She didn't speak because speaking would require her to use her voice, and her voice would betray her, and she could not afford to be betrayed. "That will be all," Pierce said. She left the office. Down the hallway. Down the stairs because she couldn't stomach the elevator, couldn't handle the fluorescent box and the close walls. She descended 3 flights on legs that moved with the autopilot precision of someone who'd learned long ago how to function when everything inside was breaking. By the time she reached her car in the parking lot, it was 3:27 p.m. 13 minutes past her daughter's usual school dismissal time. But she wasn't picking up her daughter today. Because today she had nowhere to be except home, and being home meant explaining things that couldn't be explained. The drive took 22 minutes. She sat in traffic on Route 64, watching the brake lights of other people's cars stretch out like a river of red. Her phone buzzed. Once. Twice. 3 times. Text messages from her sister, asking why she wasn't picking up Emma from school. Emma's after-school program coordinator, asking when she'd be arriving. Hannah turned the phone off. Her house was a small craftsman bungalow in East Raleigh, pale yellow with black shutters, the kind of place a single mother working a hospital job could afford. The kind of place that looked normal from the outside. Utterly, completely normal. She parked in the driveway at 11 p.m. Walked inside. Sat down at the kitchen table without removing her scrubs or her shoes. Just Saturday. In the fading afternoon light coming through the window, dust motes drifting like tiny dying things. The sound of her sister's car pulling up the driveway came at 4:27 p.m. A door opening. Small footsteps on the walkway. Excited voice, "Mommy? Mommy, I'm home. Aunt Sarah said you had to work late but..." Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway. 7 years old. Small face. Dark eyes exactly like Hannah's, inherited directly, no deviation. She was still wearing her school uniform, navy jumper, white shirt, small backpack that swallowed her shoulders. The moment she saw her mother sitting at the table at 4:41 p.m. instead of arriving at 7 p.m., her excitement collapsed. "Mommy, why are you home early?" The voice was small. Confused. The way a child sounds when the world has suddenly stopped making sense. Hannah opened her mouth. Closed it. She looked at her daughter, this small, perfect person who had never known her mother was anything other than a nurse named Hannah Clarke who worked hard and came home tired and loved her more than anything in the world. "Come here, baby." Emma approached slowly, suddenly uncertain. Hannah pulled her close. The weight of her was real. The warmth. The smell of her hair, apple shampoo and something else, something that was just Emma, something that couldn't be replicated or explained. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that in 48 hours, everything would change. That federal agents would come calling. That the Pentagon would make phone calls that would alter the trajectory of her daughter's entire existence. That Emma would grow up knowing her mother wasn't just a nurse. That the carefully constructed life would shatter like it had always been made of glass. For now, though, Hannah held her daughter. Let the child's hair brush against her cheek. Breathed into the moment before the world collapsed. "I'm tired, sweetheart," Hannah whispered. "Mommy's just very tired." The monitor's rhythm skipped. Once. Twice. Hannah's hands froze mid-check on the general's radial pulse. His skin had gone the color of wet concrete. Oxygen saturation dropping like a stone thrown into dark water, 89%, 84, 78. His chest heaved but his lungs weren't filling. The sound of it, that wet gasping, was the same sound she'd heard in Helm and when shrapnel collapsed a Marine's lung cavity and she'd had exactly 90 seconds to choose between protocol and survival. His trachea had deviated sharply to the left. Severe. Textbook tension pneumothorax, one side of his chest hyperresonant to percussion, jugular veins bulging like ropes beneath his skin, lips taking on the blue-gray cast of someone drowning in air that wouldn't come. The code team was 90 seconds away. Maybe more. She didn't call for backup. She didn't page the attending. She ripped her access badge off the lanyard and hurled it onto the monitors, triggering the security alert that would summon every uniform in the hospital. Then she forced open the ICU door, the pneumatic hiss of the hydraulic closer sounding like a breech charge detonating, and moved toward the crash cart with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this before on blood-soaked ground under fire. 14-gauge needle. She could feel its weight in her palm like muscle memory made steel. Her left hand found his ribs with the practiced certainty of fingers that had counted intercostal spaces while mortars fell around her in Sanjan Valley. Second and third space. Midclavicular line. The anatomical landmarks were the same whether in a sterile ICU or a blown-out compound that used to be a schoolhouse. She didn't announce what she was doing. No time for words. Pain was information, and his body was screaming that she was running out of it. The needle went in smooth and true. Between the ribs. Through the pleural space. And then came the sound, the hiss of released pressure like air escaping from a tire, except this air was the difference between his next heartbeat and his last. The general's body convulsed once, hard, and then his oxygen levels began climbing. 78 to 81. 81 to 85. His breathing deepened like a man surfacing from drowning. Sinus rhythm. Steady. Present. Hannah didn't step back. She kept her hand steady on his shoulder, the other reaching for the bag valve mask to start manual ventilation, her movements precise as surgical instruments. The code team burst through the ICU doors at a sprint, 3 nurses, the respiratory therapist, the attending from trauma, all of them stopping dead when they saw a woman in scrubs standing over a stabilizing patient with a 14-gauge needle in his second intercostal space and an expression that looked like someone who had done this exact thing before under conditions that would have broken most people. The attending, Dr. Nichols, stared at Hannah's hands for 2 full seconds. Then at the monitor. Then at the general, whose oxygen sat was climbing, 85, 88, 91. Stable. Breathing. Alive. Get her away from that patient, came a voice from behind them. Dr. Pierce. His face was flushed crimson, his jaw working like he was chewing on something poisonous. But he didn't move closer. He just stood in the doorway, watching Hannah's composure settle over her like armor, watching her finish bagging the general with the calm precision of someone who had learned long ago that falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford. You violated access protocols. You performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. You've triggered a facility-wide security alert. Hannah didn't answer. She didn't look at him. She finished stabilizing the general's oxygen delivery, checked his pupil response, noted his vitals in the monitor display, and then she stepped back from the bed with her shoulders squared and her breathing even and her hands perfectly, deliberately still. Call security, Pierce said to no one in particular. Everyone. Remove her from this unit immediately. But nobody moved. The attending, Dr. Nichols, was still staring at the monitor. At the general's oxygen saturation, now at 94% and steady. At a tension pneumothorax that had been reversed in less time than it took most people to walk from the parking lot to the ER. The general's eyes opened. Weak but awake. His hand reached out and found Hannah's wrist with surprising strength for someone who had been dying 30 seconds ago. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. His grip said everything. Hannah removed her hand gently and nodded once, the kind of nod that Marines give each other when words aren't required. Then she turned and walked past Dr. Pierce, her gait steady, her badge lanyard swinging empty at her hip. The security guards who had started moving toward her froze, uncertain now. The attending hadn't called them forward. The general was stable. The patient was alive. 5 hours passed in documentation. Hannah worked methodically through the paperwork, recording every vital sign, every intervention, every timestamp in military time notation. 1,447 hours, tension pneumothorax detected. 1,448 hours, needle decompression performed at second intercostal space midclavicular line. 1,449 hours, oxygen saturation recovered to normal range. Each line was precise, dated, witnessed by the attending and 3 nurses who had watched her save a man's life using nothing but battlefield instinct and access to a 14-gauge needle. At 19:30 hours, Dr. Pierce appeared in the break room where Hannah was removing her scrubs. Behind him came the HR director and a hospital security officer. Their faces carried the weight of paperwork, of protocols, of institutional machinery grinding into motion. Conference room, Pierce said. Not a request. Now. The table was long and false and lit by fluorescent panels that buzzed with the frequency of something dying slowly. Pierce spread termination papers across the surface like a dealer laying out cards. His hands were steady. His voice carried the precision of someone who had spent the afternoon constructing his narrative with care. Nurse Clarke, you performed an invasive medical procedure without physician oversight, in direct violation of Joint Commission regulations. You accessed restricted areas without authorization. You ignored direct supervisory orders. You triggered a facility-wide security alert. I have incident reports from 4 separate witnesses, documentation of your repeated insubordination, and a complete disciplinary history. He slid another document across the table. The paper was cream-colored, official-looking, heavy with the weight of institutional authority. I filed a complaint with the State Board of Nursing this morning. Your license is under investigation for practicing medicine without a license. That's a felony in North Carolina. Hannah's eyes moved across the documents without really reading them. She couldn't defend herself. Not without revealing that her undercover status wasn't a civilian job but a classified Pentagon operation codenamed Nightingale. Not without explaining that the man she had just saved was a protected military asset. Not without destroying 7 months of operational security and every investigation that hinged on her invisibility. So she didn't speak. She signed the forms in handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone else. She removed her hospital badge and set it on the table with the precision of placing flowers on a grave. The lanyard was already gone, already empty, already part of a life that was ending in real time. You're terminated effective immediately, Pierce said. Security will escort you from the building. Hannah stood. The security officer gestured toward the door with the politeness of someone who didn't want to use force but would if necessary. She walked ahead of him through the corridors of Seattle General, past the ICU where the general was sleeping, past the break room where the other nurses had already stopped speaking her name, past the entrance where rain was hammering the parking lot like applause from a crowd that had already forgotten her. She drove home in silence. The radio stayed off. The city lights smeared across her windshield like watercolors bleeding into each other. By the time she reached her apartment, night had fallen hard and complete, and she still didn't understand how she was going to tell her daughter that Mommy wasn't a nurse anymore, that everything had come apart in the space of 90 seconds, that the life she had built was no longer hers to keep. Emma found her at the kitchen table at 3 in the afternoon the next day. Hannah was still in her pajamas, still wearing the same face she had worn when she'd signed the termination papers, still moving through the house like someone walking underwater. Her daughter's small voice cut through the silence with the precision of a blade. "Mommy, why are you home? Did you get sick?" Hannah's composure, the armor that had held through 5 hours of documentation and termination papers and institutional rejection, finally fractured. Her daughter's hand touched her face and felt the tears there, real tears, the kind that meant something had broken beyond the reach of military training or battlefield protocol. She pulled Emma into her chest and held her there, this small person who was the only honest thing left in her life, and for the first time since walking away from Helmand Province, Captain Hannah Clarke let someone see her fall apart. But that wasn't the end of it. Overnight, something had shifted. Somewhere in the Pentagon, in a building with no name and offices that didn't officially exist, the wrong alarm had been triggered. A classified security clearance had been flagged during a routine background audit. And by morning, everything was about to change in ways Hannah couldn't have imagined. The administrator's shoes clicked against Dr. Pierce's office floor at 9:19 a.m. precisely. He wasn't alone. 2 federal agents in charcoal suits followed him in, their movements economical, practiced. The kind of stillness that comes from knowing exactly how dangerous a situation is before it begins. Dr. Pierce looked up from his desk, and Hannah, watching from the corridor monitor where she was reviewing discharge charts, saw his face shift. Not anger. Fear. The kind of fear that comes when someone realizes the walls are finally closing in. "Dr. Pierce," the administrator said, his voice clipped and formal, "these agents need to speak with you regarding some personnel matters. Specifically, regarding a Captain Hannah Clarke." Through the glass partition, Hannah watched Pierce's jaw tighten. His hands moved to the desk edge, gripping it like an anchor. He'd been fishing in dangerous waters for years, moving money through phantom procedures, inflating billings, signing off on treatments that never happened. But he'd never expected anyone to actually care. Certainly not the Pentagon. "I don't know what this is about," Pierce said, but his voice had lost its surgeon's certainty. It wavered like a man standing on ice he suddenly understood was cracking. The lead agent, a woman with silver hair pulled back so tight it looked like it might hurt, stepped forward. "During a routine background check conducted by our agency, we discovered that Hannah Clarke, your former employee, maintains an active classified security clearance with the Department of Defense. That clearance was flagged during your hospital's personnel audit. We're here to clarify the circumstances of her termination." Pierce stood, his chair scraping backward so hard it nearly toppled. "She performed a procedure without authorization. I terminated her for protocol violation. Check my documentation." "We have," the agent said flatly. "We've also checked your documentation for the past 3 years. Specifically, your billing documentation." Hannah's hand stilled on the keyboard. This was it. The moment the invisible infrastructure beneath Pierce's arrogance gave way. She'd known it was coming. The Pentagon liaison had called her at home yesterday, told her to report to work today, to expect developments. But watching it happen, seeing the color drain from Pierce's face as federal agents opened folders thick with financial records, was something else entirely. Justice wasn't always fast. But sometimes, when it finally arrived, it came with the weight of the entire United States government behind it. By 11:38 a.m., the general's room at Seattle General had transformed into something between a military ceremony and a government proceeding. Hospital leadership stood along one wall. A Marine colonel in dress blues occupied the chair beside the bed, his posture rigid as steel. 2 Navy officers flanked the doorway. And in the center of it all, propped up on pillows, lay Marine General Marcus Webb, his breathing stronger than it had been in weeks, his eyes sharp and fixed on the doorway where Hannah stood in her rumpled scrubs, confusion flickering across her face. "Valkyrie," the general whispered, and his voice cracked like old leather. "That's her call sign. That's our Valkyrie from Helmand." Hannah's entire body went still. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. Somewhere in the distance, a heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm, one of the few sounds machines made that didn't feel like they were screaming. The colonel stepped forward, opening a leather folder. His voice filled the room with the weight of formal military citation. "Captain Hannah Clarke, for extraordinary heroism under fire while attached to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines in Helmand Province. On March 14, 2019, while providing emergency trauma care under sustained enemy fire, you sustained critical injuries resulting in bilateral amputation. Despite catastrophic blood loss and shock, you continued treatment of 3 wounded Marines for 47 minutes until medical evacuation arrived. All 3 Marines survived and returned to duty." Hannah's hands trembled. Not from fear. From restraint. From the weight of 5 years of being just a nurse while wearing invisible medals on the underside of her skin. A 2-star general in dress blue stepped into the room. His presence was like a pressure shift, the air compressing around him. He held a piece of fabric in his hands, faded, worn, the stitching loose on one edge. The unit patch. The one Hannah had sewn into her jacket lining the day before she arrived at Seattle General. The patch she'd worn the day the IED detonated beneath her Humvee. The patch she'd clung to while dragging Corporal Jensen through the fire, while screaming for Martinez's tourniquet, while pressing her own bleeding thighs against the dirt because her hands were the only thing saving 3 men's lives. The general saluted the patch. Not Hannah. The patch. As if honoring the woman who wore it was the same as honoring the weight it carried. "At ease, Captain," he said, and Hannah felt her shoulders drop an inch. "You've been operating under code name Nightingale for the past 14 months. Your assignment was to monitor security threats to high-value military patients at this facility. That assignment was classified. Your identity as a decorated Marine officer was classified. Your presence here was an official Pentagon operation, not civilian nursing." The room held its breath. Hannah could hear the fluorescent lights humming now, a sound she'd learned to tune out weeks ago. The ventilator in the next room wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Somewhere down the hallway, a cart rattled. The sounds of ordinary hospital life colliding with the extraordinary. Dr. Pierce, the Pentagon liaison, said, stepping through the doorway with the finality of a closing coffin lid, has been under federal investigation for TRICARE fraud for 8 months. We have evidence of 247 fraudulent billing submissions totaling $3.2 million in false claims to the military healthcare system. We have financial records. We have witness statements from 3 physicians he pressured into billing scheme participation. And we have him on secure hospital servers accessing restricted military patient files 17 times in 2 weeks. Pierce appeared in the doorway then, escorted by 2 federal agents, his face the color of wet concrete. He tried to speak, but the liaison wasn't finished. Your medical privileges are suspended effective immediately. Federal charges have been filed including healthcare fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. You'll be processed at the federal detention facility downtown within the hour. I want my lawyer, Pierce said, but his voice was barely a whisper. His hands hung at his sides like things that belonged to someone else. It wasn't a request anymore. It was a command, and the agents moved him out of the room with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this 1,000 times. His protests echoed down the hallway and then faded into nothing. Just another voice dissolving into the background noise of a building that had stopped listening to him the moment his corruption was exposed. Hannah stood in the silence that followed. 5 doctors. 3 nurses who'd peeked in from the hallway. A military liaison officer. A 2-star general. All of them looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen directed at her in months. Not pity. Recognition. The kind of respect that came from understanding that the quiet person in the corner might just be the one holding everything together. Welcome back to active duty, Captain Clarke, the 2-star general said, and he extended his hand. Hannah took it. Her grip was steady. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of 5 years of accumulated authority. Thank you, sir. Happy to serve. But that wasn't the real moment. The real moment came 6 hours later when Hannah walked into the hospital's IT department and found Marcus Chen, the tech director, sitting at a curved workstation with federal prosecutors gathered around him like students waiting for a lecture. Chen was a Marine veteran himself, 2003 to 2009, mechanic on Black Hawk helicopters, the kind of man who noticed patterns because his life once depended on it. I flagged the anomalies 3 months ago, Chen explained, clicking through security footage with the precision of someone presenting evidence that would destroy a man's freedom. Dr. Pierce accessing restricted files after midnight. Entering the general's room when he wasn't assigned. Opening financial records 17 times in 14 days. Normal accessing pattern is twice per week. This was obsession. The screen showed Pierce's office at 23:19 p.m. the previous night. His face illuminated by monitor glow. His fingers flying across the keyboard with the desperate speed of a man trying to erase his own guilt. Deletion protocols executing across his screen. Folders disappearing. Files vanishing into the void. The system created backup copies, Chen said quietly, and notified the Pentagon liaison within 90 seconds of the deletion attempt. Everything he tried to destroy was already safe. One of the prosecutors opened a folder. The sound of it, pages spreading like wings, felt louder than it should have been. We have 247 fraudulent submissions. We have bank records. We have witness statements. We have emails between Dr. Pierce and a billing coordinator discussing how to maximize claims before military patients were discharged. We have him on tape attempting to obstruct justice. Pierce's bail hearing happened at 14:15 that afternoon. His attorney argued for release pending trial. The judge looked at the evidence, the financial records, the access logs, the desperate deletion attempt caught on hospital security footage, and set bail at $500,000. Pierce couldn't make it. Federal detention was his address now. By 5 p.m., his face filled local news screens. Doctor arrested in military healthcare fraud scheme. His medical license suspended. His bank accounts frozen. His colleagues returning his calls with silence. The cafeteria staff who'd always poured his coffee first now had someone else to serve. The world he'd built on fraud and reputation collapsed in 6 hours like a building with the support columns removed. Hannah didn't watch the news. She didn't need to. Instead, she attended her formal reinstatement hearing at 8:44 a.m. the next day, where she sat in full Marine Corps dress blues while hospital leadership officially apologized, offered her choice of positions, and presented her with a formal commendation. The nursing staff who'd shunned her in the break room couldn't meet her eyes as she passed them in the hallway. Their silence was its own apology. 6 months later, Hannah walked through Seattle General's main lobby in her nursing scrubs, her prosthetic legs moving with the practiced confidence of someone who'd learned to carry weight long before her legs were taken. She carried a coffee, black, 2 sugars, and moved through the morning shift change with the invisibility of someone so competent that people forgot to notice her. A community bulletin board near the entrance caught her attention. A small flyer. White background, black text. CPR certification classes, Saturdays 9 a.m., Raleigh Community College, instructor, J. Pierce. The instructor photo showed a man aged a decade in 6 months. Grey stubble. Eyes that had learned the meaning of consequence. Teaching basic life support for minimum wage, his medical license permanently revoked, his freedom conditional on parole, his reputation evaporated like rain on hot asphalt. Hannah stared at the flyer for exactly 3 seconds. Then she continued to the elevator. The ICU held different air now. Lighter somehow. Marine General Marcus Webb stood in physical therapy, taking unassisted steps for the first time since the injury. His legs trembled, but his face held the expression of a man reclaiming something he'd nearly lost. He saluted as Hannah approached. "Still can't believe you were watching over me this whole time, Captain," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Just doing my job, General." Both of them. Beside the nurse's station hung a shadow box. Behind glass lay her silver star. Her purple heart. Her Navy Cross. And beneath them, the faded unit patch from Helmand Province, the one she'd sewn into her jacket lining 5 years ago. The one federal agents had retrieved from her locker and mounted with ceremonial precision. The plaque read, "Captain Hannah Clarke, USMC, call sign, Valkyrie, some heroes hide in plain sight." Hannah's daughter Emma's latest drawing was taped to her locker. "Mommy the captain and the nurse." Written in purple crayon with hearts scattered across the page. Hannah touched it with the back of her hand, and for the first time in months, she smiled the way she smiled when the world wasn't watching. Her phone buzzed. Pentagon liaison. New assignment? High-value patient transferring to Boston General in 3 months. Hannah typed back, "Send details." Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you're watching this, you're the kind of person who appreciates stories about hidden strength and quiet courage. Subscribe for more videos about the extraordinary people hidden in plain sight. Like this video if you believe in second chances and justice. And comment below, would you have survived what Hannah did? I'll be reading every response.